This is Black Market Leadership, the underground resource for disruptors and status quo breakers.
But the one thing that I have found fascinating, especially about mindsets, you talk about Montgomery being what you might call it slow or cautious, but what's the nature of the UK? It's a naval power and it has an army, but it's naval power. So that army and that limited manpower, you have to conserve it. So in a sense, it makes sense to doctrine. But when the war starts and Marshall, they were doing, I guess, the American strategy meetings. Marshall and a lot of American generals like, hey, we're gonna get our new American army, and we're just gonna, in 1942 or 43, we're just gonna land in Europe and attack. And the British, to my knowledge, like, are you crazy? Do you not see what just happened? This is where the whole, what I guess you call it, pecking at the periphery. This is why we went to North Africa, and hopefully the Soviets would kill the Germans.
I think you've got, sort of two issues you raised there. The first one was the Second World War. You're right. It was coalition warfare, and all the Allies had their own separate agendas, but within those agendas cooperated for the greater good, which worked, and as you rightly say, gave us victory. And you're right in your observation of Churchill. Churchill was a product of the British Empire. That was his outlook. He was an unashamed imperialist and everything it stood for. We can argue infinitum whether an empire is good or not, but that was Churchill's mindset. So yes, you're right. He wanted to preserve the empire at all costs, because he felt that's what put the great in Britain. That's what had made us great. And you're right. We were a naval nation, not so much these days, but we were a maritime power, and we ended up ruling 1/3 of the surface at one point. And Churchill knew, even by the Second World War, he knew though that our power was waning. He was conscious increasingly in the Western Hemisphere that we were reliant on the US Navy. Even before the Second World War broke out, we, like America did during the Second World War and post. Prior to the First World War, we had this sort of two-front policy that we could deploy two fleets anywhere in the world and fight two wars separately if needs be. By the late 1930s, the financial burden of doing that was pretty much too much for us anyway. We talk about the decline of the empire, and also, of course, nationalist movements have been around for a long time since the First World War. Understandably, countries were agitating for independence across the world, not just with us, but all the other colonial powers, Spain, France, Portugal, the Dutch. So it wasn't just Britain. But you're right. Churchill's worldview was that he wanted to defeat the Nazis foremost, but also, as much as he could, was to preserve the British Empire. The French took exactly the same course, but of course, that led them down a difficult path because of Vichy France, which essentially was a collaborationist, so-called neutral state in the southern part of France that wasn't occupied. And of course, all the French colonies paid lip service to Vichy and not to Charles de Gaulle, which of course caused the French and us, to be honest, an almighty headache. And then you're right, with Roosevelt, obviously he saw America as the emerging global champion of democracy. And therefore, you're right, was not amenable to the idea of supporting empire. So with the French and with us, was not keen on the idea of propping us up, after the war. That's not what he felt it was about. The right to self-determination. And of course, the Atlantic Charter set that out. I mean, that, the founding document for the United Nations, that was the very key thing that, Churchill and Roosevelt agreed to, was one of the things that people should have the right to choose their own governments. Well, if you do that, chances are they won't, they'll want to be independent. Why wouldn't they? That's fair enough. So, we fought the war with a view to safeguarding democracy, but that democracy included our empire. And of course, I think Roosevelt would have argued, well, he didn't see the empire as particularly democratic because it's ruled by us. And he took the same view with the French. And indeed, with the French, it's no secret that he was no fan of Charles de Gaulle because he felt he was a dictator in the making. De Gaulle was self-appointed. De Gaulle, in many ways, actually was like Churchill. I mean, he was a determined, driven man. He wanted to see his home country restored to its former glory. But of course, the difficult case with France was actually it was split in two, and he didn't speak for France as rightly as Roosevelt pointed out. Whereas, of course, Churchill for whatever his motives, backed de Gaulle pretty much from the start, which made de Gaulle, as he wanted, the figurehead of the Free French. And as a result of that, set him on his path to becoming the president of France after the war. And to be fair to the man, he won a democratic election. Particularly the Americans were not keen on the idea of the Free French under de Gaulle assuming military authority in the liberated areas of France for fear that there wouldn't be elections. And you can understand that. The Free French were quite ruthless in incorporating anyone that had a different political view to them.
Yeah.
The British intelligence over here spent an awful lot of time keeping an eye on the activities of not only the Vichy diplomatic consuls in the UK, but also the Free French ones, because they were essentially waging an almost mini civil war against each other on British soil. So I think you're right. The Second World War, lots of different agendas, but ultimately everyone worked together. As we know, the outcome was not what we would have hoped for. We ended up with the Cold War on our hands. But it's hard to see how we could have avoided that, actually. There's been much hand-wringing about, we should have gone into the Balkans and we should have done this and we should have done that to forestall the Soviet Union occupying Eastern Europe. But I think probably the best thing we did do was not pick a fight with them at the end of the war. Because many Germans, of course, in May 1945 were convinced that they needed to stay in uniform because Britain and America would end up going to war with Russia. Thank heavens wiser counsels prevailed and we didn't. We ended up with an armed stand. Well, as you know, it's called the Cold War, but that's a bit of a misnomer because it went hot a lot of other places, which of course conveniently leads me back to your original point about Vietnam. America threw an inordinate amount of resources and technology. I think that's a lot of people don't realize is Vietnam War was very technological. America used a lot of high-tech gear in an effort to achieve victory there. But the fundamental problem America had was, and it was a lesson it never learned from Africa, a prime example of that, it was Rhodesia, is that once your neighbors become independent and are not aligned or are aligned to certain political outlooks, you're done for. So in the case of Vietnam, of course, once the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were able to transit within impunity, build bases, recruit, and all the rest of it in Laos and in Cambodia, there was essentially nothing you could do to stop them infiltrating the South. I mean, Tet's the prime example of that in '68, this, shocking surprise offensive that they launched. But in defense of Westmoreland and the others, without taking the war into those neighboring states, there was nothing they could do. And as I say, Rhodesia is a prime example of that with neighboring Mozambique, and Zambia. So Mozambique to the east and Zambia to the north. White Rhodesia had the same problem, that he was fighting this guerrilla war against left-wing nationalist guerrillas.
Sponsored by the Soviets and by Russia, and China.
And by the Chinese, yeah, you're right. So ultimately for the Rhodesians, they spent 15 years fruitlessly fighting a guerrilla war to prevent black majority rule. Whereas actually one of the plans that had been on the table was a 15-year transition to black majority rule. And it would have been much better if they'd gone that route. Obviously, the hard lines within Smith's government didn't want to do that, so they fought. But with hindsight, they could not win. They took the war into their neighbours, but without occupying, they could not win. It's a much smaller scale war, much smaller manpower and resources committed. But the conditions were very, very similar to what happened in, Vietnam, but big. In that, as we know, Vietnamization of the South Vietnamese army, that didn't work, and we've seen that repeated in Afghanistan and in Iraq. In recent decades, is that the countries that Western coalitions go into, they quite often defeat whoever it was they wanted to defeat, but then of course have to then prop up the caretaker government that they've installed, because they don't have the same sort of military ethos and traditions that we do, to create fully fledged, fully functioning armed forces, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, the works. They don't have that tradition of doing that. They don't have proper rule of law and democracy, so corruption tends to be endemic. You know, the Afghan National Army, you know, they try, you know, and they've had lots of money poured into them and lots of training. But ultimately, you think once America has completely withdrawn from Afghanistan, what does the future hold for them? You know, it was a bit like that with Iraq. You know, as the coalition countries slowly left, it was, we've given these armies all this equipment, will they use it? You know, and if anything, history teaches us anything, obviously with Vietnam, South Vietnam, obviously once America had taken that political decision to extricate itself from the war, South Vietnam lasted for a few years and then collapsed, you know. Obviously, we can say all this with the benefit of hindsight. I mean, that's the joy of being a historian, you know. Because again, it goes back to context. You know, hindsight can be a dangerous thing. People on the ground at that time made the best available decisions based on the information they could. You know, going back to our original point, you know, it's that ultimate military project management. If you get it wrong, you lose the war. You know, you don't just lose the battle, you lose the war.
I'm going to go back to World War II with you because I want to talk about actually two things. One is, let me tell you, I know you're writing a book on the Battle of the Bulge. My grandfather was in the Bulge, and he was with the 17th Airborne, which is, you know, non-existent anymore. But it's just funny. My grandfather was actually captured by the Germans, and he was a POW for 2 months. But he used to tell me stories about being in a POW camp, and I think they had 1 potato a day. And he talked about even the German soldiers were basically starving. And I think at frostbite too. It was just a horrible time. But Battle of Bulge, my grandfather hated Patton, so I just want to tell you that because as you're writing this book on the Bulge, to me that's a fascinating time. And in fact, if I remember, there's one fact: over half the casualties of that battle were because of German defense. You keep mentioning how the Germans were really good at the defense, especially you know, adjusting and readjusting to emergencies. And I think over half those casualties that battle were actually just trying to push the Germans back. So I know that's my factoid for the audience. But I wanted to ask you about the Eastern Front, because to me, this is something that most Americans have no clue to how brutal, ferocious the Eastern Front is. And for the audience here, if you killed 17,000 people per day, every day for 4 years straight, you would have just the casualties between the Soviets and the Nazis. So you've written many books on the Eastern Front. In fact, your one on Kursk just looks fantastic.
Okay.
First question is, do you speak Russian or German, or do you read?
I don't. No, I don't.
Ooh.
So reliant on English language sources. But the great thing about the publishing industry in recent years is an awful lot of those foreign language memoirs have been published in English. I worked with an English publishing company called Greenhill, and they're noted for their translations. And what they do is they systematically contact German and Russian publishers and arrange for English language translations. And they very kindly had me write the foreword for a number of them. And they brought out a whole range of them. And if you look on their website, you can see them. But they just recently asked me to write the foreword to the memoir of a member of a German assault gun brigade. You know, and I've seen the German language version. I haven't seen the translation yet. But as you can imagine, it's full of amazing photographs, because obviously soldiers being soldiers, they didn't follow regulations. They're told not to take cameras. They took cameras, and remarkably, the photos survived. So. You know, going back to your original point, a lot of these memoirs are now available in English, you know, which is good. Again, another publishers that I've worked for, a company called Pen and Sword, they've done a lot of Soviet memoirs, you know, tank cases and all that sort of thing. So the material is out there. If you're not a linguist, it's there and ready available, which is good.
To me, it's the perfect time, because I don't think people realize that, you know, when World War II ends in 1945, all the way up to the end of the Cold War, the American army, I'm sure the British, the American military, and I'm sure the British, we couldn't get a lot of information from the Soviets. They wouldn't give us their statistics or a lot of their facts about the battles because they're probably exaggerated. So we had to instead rely on German generals. These German generals would come in and talk about the great German Wehrmacht and the severe damage they did to the Soviets, which I think when new information's come out, probably a little exaggerated. But now it seems like you have a great time that these records, I would think, might be open for new. So, like, for instance, everyone knows Kursk as the greatest tank battle in the world. Is that true? Was it actually the greatest tank battle, or were there other major tank battles the equivalent in the Eastern Front?
If I can just backtrack before I answer that question, you're right. The duty of a historian is that you have to treat all sources with a certain amount of caution. And you're right. Germans have their version of events, which is usually exonerating their performance or their defeat. They're always very fulsome in praise if they've achieved a victory. If they've been defeated, it wasn't their fault. And you're right, same with the Soviets. End of the Second World War, during the sort of 60s, they produced the official history of the Great Patriotic War, as they call the Eastern Front. And that's full of facts and figures, but you've got no way of verifying them. And we all use them. I've used them. But you always have to stick in a caveat that those histories were approved by the Soviet system. So they are Soviet propaganda. So, if it says they knocked out 8,000 tanks, does that really mean 800? 4,000? What does that mean? So you're right. You have to be very. So the problem you have, it's twofold, actually, as foreign sources become available, and a lot of them have been available for many years, you have to treat them with a certain amount of caution because there's an agenda. There's always an agenda with everything. The other thing is, of course, witnesses to history are a bit like witnesses to a car crash. No two people will agree, so you'll get different, as a historian, it drives me mad. The figures never match, dates don't match, locations don't match. It's a real challenge. In the end, you have to take the common denominator and decide on that quite often. But yes, being a historian, you have to make judgment calls sometimes. You can caveat it, in your references and your footnotes, but all historians have to make judgment calls on whether they think what they are repeating is actually correct. So it is a bit of a challenge. Makes it part of the fun of the job, actually, because it's detective work. Going back to Kursk, you're right. The narrative is marvelous victory for the Red Army, turned the tide on the Eastern Front. And there have been a number of histories in recent years that actually have started to pour scorn on that and say, actually, it wasn't a great victory. The Germans didn't suffer as heavily as they did, a lot of which, of course, is correct. But ultimately, the fact remains that the Germans lost the bulk of their offensive capability as a result of that battle. So it meant they were on the defensive from that point on. They could do local counterattacks, but in terms of conducting strategic offensives, which they'd done every summer since 1942, after 1943, they couldn't do it because they did not have the resources or the manpower, and particularly the tanks, the panzers. But yes, it's a crucial battle. Writing that particular book, the thing I learned was actually, again, Soviets never liked to acknowledge America's contribution through Lend-Lease, so the thousands of trucks and tanks and aircraft that America supplied, and indeed that Churchill supplied beforehand, so before America entered the war. When we needed them elsewhere, we needed them in the Far East and North Africa, but Churchill took a decision that he would help Stalin, regardless. So we shipped an awful lot of equipment at a time when we couldn't really spare it in the name of helping, because Churchill knew that obviously if Hitler got to Moscow and Stalin fell from power, then the Soviet Union might sue for peace, and then we were really in trouble. But Stalin was never forward in coming and acknowledging that sacrifice made by both Britain and America, particularly the Arctic convoys, of course, where the losses were absolutely appalling. And then likewise, Stalin under the Soviet system was not one to acknowledge Western intelligence. So Bletchley Park intelligence was passed to the Soviet Union on the eve of that battle, telling him categorically the start dates pretty much for the German offensive. Now, to be fair to the Red Army, of course, they had spies, they had reconnaissance aircraft, they had their own form of SIGINT, collection, so they knew themselves. but we gave them confirmation. In fact, I'm going from memory here now, but we even supplied them an order of battle of the German forces. So, there was all that intelligence sharing that we did, but the Red Army never acknowledged that they won that battle with the help of the West. It's common knowledge now that most of the Red Army was transported in American lorries and trucks because Russian factories concentrated on building artillery, aircraft, and tanks, particularly tanks and the famous T-34. So all the Studebakers and the Dodges and everything else that America shipped were key in providing mobility for the Red Army. But unless you delve into that, people don't appreciate that. Again, you see photographs of the Red Army rolling into Berlin. It's quite often they're in American trucks.
Since you've done so much writing on World War II and even in the Eastern Front and the Western Front, I'm curious, what are the key differences between the Eastern Front and the Western Front?
Well, the key difference was one of ideological outlook. So as I'm sure you're aware, under Hitler's Nazi ideology, they saw the Slavs, so a big percentage of the population in Eastern Europe and indeed in the Soviet Union, as what he called Untermenschen, subhuman. So it meant conduct of war in the East was completely different in the West. I mean, we had atrocities in the West, both by Western allies and more predominantly by the Germans, going back to the Battle of the Bulge. You've got the Malmedy massacres. You've got the massacres during the Normandy campaign with the French. But on the whole, the conduct of war, as much as it can be, was quite civilized in the West. Aid was provided to wounded. POWs on the whole were treated reasonably well. So there was a certain code of conduct that both sides adhered to on the Western Front. Didn't always work, but on the whole. In the Eastern Front, that code of conduct did not exist. So Germans had little time for Soviet casualties. They had little time for taking prisoners. During the first part of the invasion of the Soviet Union, they took something like 6 million prisoners. A big chunk of those died before they ever reached Germany because they simply didn't feed them. They didn't give them water, medical treatment. They just marched them to the nearest railhead and then shipped them to Germany to work in the factories. And I can't remember the figure, but I think something like about a third ever went home because they were so badly treated, they just died. So the level of war was a lot more barbaric on the Eastern Front, which partly accounts for why the casualty figures were that much higher. And also, I think historically and culturally, Germany had a lot more in common than with the West than it did with the Soviet Union. The other thing, of course, is remember that historically Germany had fought on the Eastern Front during the First World War, so it fought the Russians. So there was that historical bad blood. There was that historical competing for space in Eastern Europe, over the fate of countries like Poland, which was constantly being dismembered. So the Germans saw, I think, the Russians as their hereditary enemies. There's that fear of the East. It almost sort of dated from the time of the Mongols, when there was that Far Eastern threat that got to the very gates of Vienna. That sort of psychologically lingered, I think, certainly in Western culture. And of course, the thing that you forget with the Soviet Union was that same with the Russian Federation today, is essentially an empire, because it's not ethnically and culturally one thing. It's very, very diverse. And obviously we saw when the Soviet Union collapsed that a lot of the Central Asian nations gained independence. But when you think a large proportion of the Red Army actually was Central Asians, so they were Tajiks, Kazakhs, Turks, and a lot of them couldn't even speak Russian. They were drafted into the Russian army. Germans rounded them up as prisoners. They couldn't even, you couldn't use a Russian translator because they couldn't even speak Russian. So there was this sort of threat from the East all the time, and also, of course, ideologically, the Germans had that sort of Weimar Republic period when there was that fear that Bolshevism would take over Germany, and of course, there'd been that international intervention in Russia during the late, after the First World War and the early 1920s. So there was that sort of cultural, historical animosity towards Russia, and obviously when it became the Soviet Union. So there just simply was not that level of, I'm not sure respect's the right word, but there wasn't that level of understanding or tolerance. It was for the Germans, it was total war, that they were going to win. I mean, how they thought they were going to win, I don't know. Hitler thought he was going to. The trouble Hitler had with invading the Soviet Union, of course, was that he was intoxicated by what had happened in the West. His blitzkriegs in 1940-41, quite militarily, remarkable, absolutely remarkable in what they achieved. But of course, he was blinded by that. That he thought that the Wehrmacht could turn on the Soviet Union and it would have the same impact. But because the Soviet Union was so vast, well, even if he took Moscow and got to the Urals, what would happen then? Even if Stalin fell from power and the Soviet Union sued for peace, what would happen then? Well, they would rebuild their armies, and eventually there would be another war, or there would be an armed standoff until such time as the Soviets decided that they wanted to retake their territory. So it beggars belief that Hitler thought he could win. I mean, it's, in the cold light of day, with all that distance of time, you just cannot understand his mindset. I mean, but of course, what he thought was quick victory. Within 6 weeks, he'd take Moscow. Stalin may or may not fall from power, but would certainly be forced to sue for peace. Just say, I think I mentioned earlier, the Germans captured something like 6 million prisoners, not to mention all the ones that they killed and wounded. So you would think, well, the Red Army cannot recover from that. In the opening days of the attack, they destroyed most of the Soviet tank fleet, all their aircraft. There was no way they could come back from that, but they did. Mm-hmm. And German intelligence, actually, way before the invasion, behind the scenes, had been warning Hitler that the Soviet Union had this vast manpower, something like 200 million people. Well, if they only mobilized 10% of that, that was a lot of men. In very quick, short order, after the invasion, even after the invasion, the Soviets were putting together fresh armies that amounted to 1 million guys, and had another 1 million guys that they were in the process of mobilizing. So they had 2 million replacements on the way. Being the Soviet Union, of course, they had the Gulag, which had 2 million people in it. A lot of those could be conscripted, and indeed they did. They took out about 1 million. So you're immediately going, Soviet Union was able to generate 3 million replacements that's not scraping the barrel. That was, off the top of the pile, if you like. I mean, they'd mobilized a lot of their guys, obviously, in the run up to and post the invasion. But the Soviet Union had this massive manpower pool that Germany simply could not match. But Hitler chose to ignore those facts and say he knew that before the invasion, but he chose to ignore it.
If I remember right, to me, one of the most fascinating elements about the decision making to go into Russia, and it's funny, like you say, you can't imagine the calculus, but if you take the ideas of National Socialism, I mean, they're thoroughbred, they're thorough racists. They think that the Slavs, like you said, the Untermenschen. I mean, in a sense, that's like that's the monkey to the man. It like that kind of level of difference. It's not like a dumb person. Like they really believe they're subhuman. So you take that philosophical belief, then you look at the history. Remember, the Russians finished the Winter War, and was it 500,000 casualties to the 50,000 Finns? So it's a 10-1. And they knew that Stalin had purged 90% of his generals. So if you take their past successes and you look at this potential enemy, and of course, when Hitler says, when we kick the door down, the whole rotten structure will fall. Yeah. So, but the irony is, if I remember right, there's only 3 major highways in Russia. That was, going to Leningrad, Moscow, and to Rostov, right, on Don. So, or maybe I can't, maybe not Rostov, but my point is, it's just amazing that, like you said, you get so.
But you're right, because you're right there with the context. So if you look what was happening in Western Europe, the Red Army was a shambles. As you say, with Finland, it was a disaster. However you looked at it, the performance of the Red Army was a complete disaster. But of course, what the Germans did was they looked at that, and you're right, the ongoing purges of the Red Army that had happened during the 1930s and the Russian Air Force and the Navy, they'd all suffered. So a lot of the good generals, Tukhachevsky being one of the prime examples, he was an advocate of armored warfare. All these people had been purged and either thrown into the Gulag or executed. So the Germans looked at that side of things. What they didn't do was, of course, go the other side of the Soviet Union in the Far East in 1939. A general by the name of Zhukov gave the Japanese a mauling at a place called Khalkhin Gol. And that mauling was such that the Japanese, when the Second World War broke out, they had the strike north or strike south option for their military. And obviously they looked at what had happened with the Red Army, so they struck south and they attacked, obviously, the Americans in the Philippines and the Brits and the Dutch in the Far East. So they struck south. But what that meant was, of course, Japan had a treaty with the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union was not required to fight a two-front war. And for Hitler, that was a strategic disaster because, of course, it meant Zhukov was sat there with all those battle-hardened divisions. He knew what he was doing because he tried it in the field. He knew the value of tanks. He knew the value of aircraft and artillery, all acting in concert. He, like Tukhachevsky, was a tank advocate. So he was an armored man at heart, and he understood that they should be used as an armored fist, not to support the infantry, that they should go first, followed by the infantry. So he understood how to use them. So he had all these divisions, and the Siberian army sat there, in the Far East and Siberia. And because they weren't needed there to face the Japanese, of course, come the winter of 1941, they were all shipped west, which of course helped save Moscow. So you're right. So Hitler looked at what had happened in Western Europe, but for some reason or other chose to ignore the warning of what had happened to the Japanese. Now, to be fair, the Japanese army was equipped to fight the Chinese, not the Red Army. So actually, it fought at a disadvantage. I mean, to be fair, it had tanks and aircraft and artillery like the Russians, but its equipment really was geared up for fighting infantry-heavy Chinese armies. That's what it had been doing for the last decade or so. So the Germans ignored that. I mean, again, I'm surprised that lots of people don't know that Russian-Japanese war took place in 1939. Sort of popular perception is that they don't realise one of the reasons that the Japanese turned south was because they'd suffered a serious defeat at the hands of the Russians. So they went with Plan B rather than Plan A, which for of course Hitler really long term was the kiss of death.
And it saved Zhukov. It saved him because he was over in the east. He had victory, and all these other generals in the west are being killed. So he survived. Yeah,
and also because Zhukov's a prime lesson, because initially Stalin was like Hitler. He tried to micromanage the war, and everything that he insisted happened went wrong. Of course, when Hitler did that, he blamed his generals. He didn't go, okay, your experience, you know what you're doing, and stepped back. He didn't learn from that. He persisted in micromanaging the war, which ultimately contributed to the defeat of Nazi Germany. Whereas with Stalin, initially, he tried that. He blamed his generals for what happened in the summer of 41, had lots of them executed. He said it was all their fault. Whereas actually the Red Army knew that it was Stalin's fault because they had intelligence that Hitler was massing in eastern Poland and Prussia, and that invasion was imminent. But Stalin insisted on, doing nothing to antagonize Hitler, so had left really the Soviet Union open to invasion. I mean, what happened in the summer was firmly Stalin's fault. And in fact, Timoshenko, who's their chief of staff, who was the head of the Red Army, and Zhukov, who by then was his chief of staff, they surreptitiously organized for major military maneuvers and exercises in the Russian Western Military District in the summer of 41 in an effort to get round Stalin's refusal to fully mobilize to face the Nazi threat. So they tried to get round it. Of course, what happened was they ended up with the worst of both scenarios, in that, of course, those divisions that they were moving west were not fully mobilized nor equipped. So when Hitler hit them, it was at the optimum time to do so. A lot of their artillery was still in the depots. The crews had not trained to use the tanks. They're still being issued with uniforms and rifles and all the sorts of things you need when you move large numbers of men. So, of course, actually, they played into Hitler's hands, not intentionally. But, of course, what they were trying to do was get round Stalin's ban on doing anything to antagonize Hitler by conducting large-scale military operations, by shifting, their troops westwards. I wrote a book a few years ago, and I had a nice anecdote at the beginning, and it was about this military district commander in the Far East being summoned to Moscow on the eve of war. And of course, normally, if you were a district commander and you got summoned to Moscow, it meant something serious, firing squad, or probably that you were going to be executed. And while he was on his plane flying to Moscow, he could see train after train of troops moving west. And of course, that was thanks to the likes of Zhukov, who'd gone, we need to find a way of mobilizing that won't get us in trouble, so we'll do that. And luckily, of course, when he got to Moscow, he actually found Red Army headquarters in a flurry of activity. And actually what they wanted from him was a report on the readiness of his troops and his units, because, of course, they were wrapping their heads around what units could they redeploy from elsewhere around the Soviet Union. But I'd say, for me, that was a nice anecdotal story. I mean, you can imagine his sense of fear when the telegram arrived at his headquarters going, you've got to go to Moscow. And I think he'd already been there previously on exercises. They'd had that map exercise or something in Moscow, so he'd already been there. So the fact that he was being called back, filled him with alarm, because he thought, he was in for the bullet. Actually, he wasn't.
Boss wants to see you.
but he recalled, seeing these trains. So, but the other thing, going back to your question about the barbarity on the Eastern Front, and me saying it was ideological. What came after the Wehrmacht, of course, were the German Einsatz group and the special operations groups, whose job, was to murder people, be they intelligentsia or Jews or the mentally fit, the disabled. The Nazis had this abhorrent liquidation program, which even before the final solution was put into, full swing, following behind the German invasion forces came these horrible units whose job was to murder people. And of course, again, the narrative for them was that they were these mindless psychopathic monsters. Because in recent years it's come out, actually no, they were normal everyday human beings
sorry.
Yeah,
I was going to say, if I remember right, there is a fantastic documentary on Netflix, came out several years ago. It's great. If I remember right, 75% of their commanders had PhDs.
Yeah, wouldn't surprise me. But yeah, well, and as a result, of course, they're intelligent people, and a lot of them ended up with PTSD. The commanding officers of those units had to be sent back to recuperation camps, sent on holiday, all sorts of things. Your average soldier quite often gets PTSD from combat. So you being physically ordered, doesn't matter how fervent a Nazi you are, deep down you're still somewhere a human being. So the idea of them all being heartless killers is actually not true. For a lot of them, they were traumatized by what they were doing. But unfortunately, of course, they followed orders. Particularly in Poland and in Ukraine, when they got into particularly the Jewish ghettos, they just set about systematically murdering people. And of course, when they came to the conclusion that they couldn't do it through firing squad quick enough, they then began to look at alternate methods, which end up with the concentration camps and the gas chambers. So you saw that, in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union, where, of course, final solution was on a lesser scale in the West. Not that it didn't happen, because, of course, France and Italy, they cooperated with the Nazis and sent many of their own Jews, to the gas chambers by shipping them to Germany and Poland. So there was, but the scale of the operation, obviously, in the East was far greater. Again, down to this ideological hatred that they had, A, for the Jews and B, for the Bolsheviks, and they'd shown what they were capable of after they'd gobbled up Western Poland, obviously with the Katyn forest massacres, where they systematically butchered the officer corps of the Polish army to stop them leading resistance. It was a cold, calculated decision to do that to prevent military commanders taking to the woods and forests of Poland and leading resistance groups. They simply massacred them. Now, a more civilized way of doing that would have been to put them into prisoner of war camps, but as we know, the Nazis massacred 15,000 plus. Actually, no, sorry, I'm getting confused. It was the Soviets, wasn't it? It's Eastern Poland. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, my history's failing me there. It was the Soviets that murdered the officers in Katyn in Eastern Poland, not the Germans. Because then when the Germans rolled in, of course, they dug them up and tried to discredit the Soviets, saying, I think that's right. My memory's hazy on that one.
No. In fact, if I remember, Yeah, I think the Germans found it and then try to show the world how evil the Soviets were.
Even though the Soviets blamed it. Yes. It was the Soviets. Yes, because it was later raised with Stalin, who denied it. I think documents and photos were smuggled out by the Polish underground. And Stalin later denied it and said, he wasn't holding any Polish army prisoners, which of course wasn't true, because aside from the ones that he had shot, a lot were shipped to Russia and held in camps, because of course they ended up forming a national army, which then joined the Brits in North Africa and in Italy. Quite surprisingly, Stalin let them go.
Anthony, this has been a fantastic discussion. Where can people find you besides Amazon? Besides, your whole slew of books on Amazon. Where else can they find you?
And I'm on LinkedIn. People can find me on that. But that's about the only social media platforms I use. I've got a website, so they can find me on that. Yeah, it's atuckerjones.com. I think it's Anthony at atuckerjones.com.
atuckerjones.com. There we go. There's your bio, and people go to Amazon. You have a cornucopia of World War II, Cold War.
I have quite a large back catalog.
It's amazing. So again, thank you for this. This has been a fantastic discussion. This has really been a lot of fun. I really appreciate you taking your time to do this.
Well, thank you for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
All right, people. There you go, Mr. Anthony Tucker Jones. You want some World War II books, some real fascinating history, you got to go to Amazon, check out his new stuff. And your book on Churchill, that comes out soon?
It's coming out end of November. I think the US launch is scheduled for the 25th of November.
Exciting. Anthony, I think you could probably do a course on how to write a book. Just our analysis here, are things we've been talking about, your keen mind. I love it. I think people would like to learn how you think. So hope you keep that in mind.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, have a great rest of your day. Okay.
Okay, Kevin. Thank you again.
All right. Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you like this content and want to hear other things like it, head on over to the website at blackmarketleadership.com. That's blackmarketleadership.com. There you can subscribe to the podcast, and you can even create a free members profile